being an artist was an actual job, like the person you see here, making these moose statues. You graduate from art school and then you become an artist and you go and make art, right? And now, it's not necessarily so that the state told you what to make. Like they didn't say this woman had to make a moose, but they would indicate what you should not do, right? So she can make any kind of animal. What she would probably not do was a type of gay Zapata painting of this moose in a sexual act with Stalin. That would not end well for her in case she would have made that statue, right? So in that sense, there was censorship, especially under Stalin. So the government controlled part of the media, so they would use it directly for their message. But also, if you didn't directly work like as the state, under Stalin, there would be censorship with that. For example, you could not make that type of statue. Later on, after him, this became more liberal, and you had critical art in the 70s and 80s. But in the 40s and 50s, you did not have that. Yet again, if you being an artist is an actual job, right, with a wage, etc. So you did have that opportunity if you wanted to create art to just do that for a living. As a whole, the point here is that culture was very different from ours, right? The culture, to go back to the previous image, is about glorifying normal people, right? On TV, you would not have the Kardashians, where you would see how some Botoxy billionaires live, right? And then we would all be staring at them, or royalty TV, or any of this nonsense. It would be about normal people. It would be like if you watched Discovery Channel or something like that, right? It's kind of working class type entertainment. You also see it in their art. Their art usually depicts people doing stuff, like here, or people playing ice hockey, or the people at work, or things like that, right? It would be about you, not about famous people. The culture would be oriented around normal people. Except under Stalin, there would also be a cult of personality around him. Not all communist countries had that. For example, Cuba doesn't. There are no statues, as far as I think, of Fidel Castro. There are murals, but no statues of him. But of Stalin, there were a lot. Practically every official had a statue on the of Stalin while Stalin was alive. They got rid of this again, and culture changed. But for that 20 years, 20, 30, 28 years that he was in power, it increasingly became about him and the people. Let's say they were your two kind of main objects of culture. So that's the cultural side of this. Now let's talk a bit about the socio-political nature of things, right? To start with, we need to talk about women. Lenin was somewhat of a feminist in his day. Lenin, when he started Soviet Union, one of the first things he did was to institutionalize full political and legal equality for women. First country on earth to do that was a communist country in 1918. Netherlands soon after, but not back then. He did that, and very soon after that, they went to work on making the second wave of feminism, right? The more practical social equality. So women could do any job, women were encouraged to be in the labor force. They would actually facilitate that by having daycare, right, and free school, so you didn't have to watch your kids. And very early on, like 40 years before the rest of the world started doing this. So woman emancipation was a lot faster in Soviet Union, right? The picture you see here is from 1964, two girls out in Moscow. So that's one part of politics, right? Just to touch on that subject. Now, how did politics itself work? Well, the communist Soviet Union was unsurprisingly ruled by the Communist Party. So there was only one party, the Communist Party, at least later on. And the leadership of this party would take the decisions. They had a council of about 10 people, the number varied over time, called the Politburo, that's the name of it. And the Politburo was the standing government. They would make all major decisions. From there, you would get the secretaries. and they had themselves a secretary, the secretary of the chairman, let's say, of this council, and that person would function as the president. So they didn't actually have a president, they had a chairman of the council of the Communist Party, and that person, so let's say the party leader, would also be de facto the boss of the country. So that was Stalin, Khrushchev, etc., Brezhnev, all these people were all chairmen of the Politburo. So they would have the power, right? And you could not from the outside take that power from them, but you could call this a dictatorship, especially under Stalin, that makes a lot of sense to call it like that. However, they themselves did have some sort of democracy, not democracy in the way that we understand it. This was not a democracy with protection against the minority, with multi-party elections, with free campaigns and this and that. You didn't have that, but you did have elections. The parliament, the Soviets, that's what Soviet Union comes from, were elected, right? To get in parliament, you needed to run, and you people need to vote for you. And they could vote on other candidates. You just all were part of the Communist Party, though. There was no anti-communist party, let's say. But within that, you still had to win elections. And it had this tiered system. So if you want to be president, right, you had to first get voted into you had to be voted leader of the council. To get in the council, you had to be voted up from parliament. To get in parliament, you had to first get into regional parliaments, right? From there, you need to, get elected in your city, and to get elected in your city, you need to get elected in your company, because democracy was all companies, right? So, for example, Khrushchev, my favorite of their presidents, Khrushchev was an illiterate farmer. He was born in Ukraine before the revolution. He grew up without going to school, herding pigs. Then, when communism came, he went to school. He then started working cleaning, I think, cleaning engines in a factory. Then he had the idea, I want to be boss of this factory. So he's like, hey, government, I want to be the boss. The government was like, well, I think you need to study engineering before you can be in charge of this plant. So then he studied engineering. Then he got voted to be the boss. Then he had political ambitions. So he tried to become the governor of Ukraine. He did become that. And then they again voted him all the way into the council. Then Stalin killed all the other people, died himself, and then Khrushchev was like the last man standing, and he became president. So you could make it all the way from the bottom to the top, even as an outsider, right? So, okay, that's not a liberal democracy, yes. You could call it a dictatorship, although it has its own internal democracy. I want to remind you, though, that at the same time in Mexico, we had the same thing, right? We were not a liberal democracy either. We also had just the here. In terms of religion, right, to also touch upon that, the official religion, but there's no official religion, but the preferred religion, the religion that the Communist Party promoted, was atheism, was no religion. So that's what you would get in school, right? They would show you pictures of outer space and say, look, God isn't there, right? Because they went to space as the first people. So that was what the government wanted, but people did have a right to freedom of religion, right? Officially, you had the right to freedom of religion. It was just disencouraged by the government. For example, here you can see a poster of the government which warns people that the church is going to steal their money, which is partly true, right? So you could have a religion. You had Orthodox people, you had Catholic people, you had Muslims, you had all kinds of religious minorities in Soviet Union, but they would not get money from the government, let's say, to do anything. Neither did the government really help them to get, let's say, a permit to build a church or anything like that, right? And in school, it wasn't taught like that, although you had freedom of religion privately. Politically, of course, this is a giant mistake, right? If they were more Machiavellian, what they should have done is take Catholicism and make a communist interpretation of that, which, since you've read the Bible, you understand that's not that hard to do. But they didn't. So they didn't, they didn't have religion on their side, let's say, like most other countries did do. They just tried to kind of ignore it, politically speaking. Then the last slide on it, I want to touch upon technology, science and technology. Contrary to what you might think, Soviet Union actually kept up with the West until 70s, 80s, until 80s with technology. For example, the vehicle you see there is a 1975 electrical car. So some of you think that Elon Musk invented the electrical car. No, some communists 40 years ago invented the electrical car. They also, by the way, invented the flying car in 1962, but they didn't tell you that in school, did they? So they did a lot of things. They were the first one to be in space. They first to have a satellite in space, first have a dog in space, first have a person in space, first have a woman in space, not the first to get to the moon. The United States put all their money in winning that race. So technologically, they would keep up, right? They just had a different focus on what they would do with their technology. In capitalism, technology, either the government does things, right? But that doesn't make it capitalist, like getting to the moon. Or it would be more focused on consumer goods, right? Developing better Botox or something like that. And that makes it more innovative because you have more players trying to do things. In communism, you don't spend resources on that. You try to go for public works, right? So they did a lot of big things, technologically speaking, building a lot of hydraulic dams. They even changed a river once, not just the track, the course of a river, like it started flowing the other way. Madness. It kind of failed in the end, but they tried it. So they tried to do very big public works like metros, etc., etc., etc. And the technological development was guided by public and military purpose, not commercial purpose. So what they made was usually useful, right, for people. It was not just cool things. It was at an actual purpose. Although long term, less innovative because you have less actors in this, right? But the idea that they're low tech is again maybe a Cuban misunderstanding. Cuba is very low tech, but Soviet Union was not for its time. Also, their views on science, just very quickly, I don't want to dwell too long on this. Communists of that generation, Stalin, also Mao, were very convinced of empiricism over rationalism. We saw that debate before, right, between Locke and Hobbes. Empiricism is the idea that you need to test things, and they were very convinced that you needed to test things to see if they worked out. That goes for policy, it also goes for technology. And they were very convinced of the idea that you could change basically anything that lives by changing its environment, whether it's corn or pineapples or cows or people, right? They didn't believe that things really had an essence. They believed that things were variable. And thus humans are too. So the idea was, yeah, humans might have been bad and corrupt and selfish. We're just going to try to change that, right? We're going to re-educate people. We're going to create a world which it never really reached because it ended before that. A world in which there is no need. People don't have a reason to be bad to each other. In which people understand that they're part of a bigger group. And thus we're going to get bigger people. Right? That's why they push so much culture. And in some ways they did. Right? In Poland, near the end of communism, as an anecdote, right? Nobody would lock their car because everybody had a car. So why do you steal someone else's car? What are you going to do with that car anyway? You'd be the weird guy with two cars, right? The only one in the whole city. So people didn't lock their houses, didn't lock their cars because, there's no real point to crime. In general, these are quite safe countries to be in. So there's some indications that partly worked, but of course didn't go perfect. So that, dear students, is in short the things I have to tell you about life under communism, right? Pros and cons to it, but probably not the total hellscape that Hollywood made you think. Now let's talk how it ended, right? About the fall of communism. Often people talk in the West about the collapse of communism, but it's a very ideologically charged word because communism never collapsed. Collapse means that, you know, the whole thing comes down, right? There's a revolution, nothing worked, and it just implodes, like the economy, you know, stops working. That never happened. Communism never collapsed. The economy never collapsed. Neither was there a giant uprising that overthrew the communist government. It was ended top down, not bottom up. The leaders were the ones who said one day, Gorbachev said, oh, well, maybe let's try to slowly move away from this and allow more freedoms, and maybe, you know, let's try capitalism, right? Maybe the people seem like they are tired of this, so let's do that. And it was actually quite controlled. This whole idea of a collapse is misleading. Can you still hear me, by the way?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So they simply ended it themselves. Now, why is this? It's a very debated topic, right? In my point of view, there's four reasons. The first one is because it was simply very hard to do what they were trying to do. Russia was the poorest country in Europe when they started this. It just went against everything. They had 2 world wars over them, got destroyed twice. They had internal warfare. They had the United States as their main enemy. This was very hard since the beginning, let's say, to do. And for these reasons, because it was so hard, they often got very hard leaders who were not on, you know, they skipped a few steps in the route towards democracy, right? They took a less democratic route since the beginning and never really got back from that. So that's bubbles from the start that would dialectically come out in the long run. The other thing is they partly lost because they got beaten by the West. The West was actively trying to end communism, United States and their allies in Europe, right? By permanent efforts to sabotage, again, 2 world wars, but also any efforts to isolate, to stop communism. They stopped communism in Latin America, stopped them from gaining new allies. Just, for example, I don't know of Stalin, I do know of Fidel Castro. They tried to kill Fidel Castro 500 times. And this is according to the CIA themselves. 500 times they tried to assassinate their leader, right? Gives you an idea of the scale of opposition they were facing. And even if they were able to keep up, because you probably had classes on the Cold War yet, right? The problem was that Russia was competing with a country that was simply stronger than them. The United States was bigger, had more people, was rich before they even started. Europe had all these colonies, right? They were simply not in the same weight class, yet in terms of military, they were evenly matched, which meant that Russia was spending a lot more money on their army than the others were, right? Percentage-wise. Because they had to keep up with a stronger competitor, which means that near the end, they were spending so much money on building tanks that they started losing sight of the communist part of things and building hospitals and houses and that kind of stuff and consumer goods for the people. People got tired of that in the end because they didn't have enough resources. The third reason is Stalin himself. Stalin just destroyed the spirit of the whole project. Stalin was an effective leader. He was not an idiot, but he was a very hard dictator. Now, there's a lot of other hard dictators, like we had in Mexico, for example, at the same time, but they were called presidents, but in practical sense, they were dictators. The difference is Stalin was clinically insane, not in a funny way. Stalin suffered from severe paranoia. Stalin constantly thought that everybody was trying to kill him, so he tried to kill them first, which is a very dangerous thing for the big leader to have, right? So he killed most of his own party, which are other communists, not the opposition, his own people, He killed most of them, like over half. In total, he killed about 1 million people via direct order. Did any of you saw Death Note, the anime?
Yes.
Yes.
Stalin literally had a Death Note book. Literally, he had the book on his desk. He'd have a blue pencil. If you would write your name in that book, you would die next day, right? Secret Service would take that book, they would look at the name, they would find you, you would be gone. So he killed a lot of people. He also got a lot of people in prison, although of Gulag. He did throw a lot of people in there. Against the very American understanding of are not concentration camps where you go to die. Yes, they're prison. They're prisons where you're forced to work. They have a death rate of 5%, which means 20 go in and each year one dies, which is average, globally speaking. So they didn't send you to that camp to die. 19 out of 20 people came back out of that camp, right? Because they were killers or thieves or rapists, etc. But also Stalin sent a lot of political prisoners there. Not to die, though. Very common misunderstanding. They did not have more people in jail than the US, and not more people died in jail than the US. But they were sent there for political reasons. Now the problem is that they try to get rid of this, right? The guy after Stalin was like, oh my God, I need to stop this nonsense. So they tried to improve it, they tried to compensate the people, family that he killed, etc. But it never went away, right? If you kill 1 million people, it's 1 million families. A lot of people are never going to forgive you, right? No matter what you do afterwards. So this built a resentment that even 50 years later, they could never really surpass, even if they had much better leaders and much softer leaders afterwards. So Stalin screwed it up. And lastly, you have this economic slowdown, which you have everywhere in the world. The problem is that in communism, the government is responsible. Motivated, because there was nothing else. You couldn't blame the market, right, for that.
Ya no quiero hacer nada.
And what's wrong, miss? Do you have a question? Okay. Yes, now. It's important to tell the full story, right? So communism ended. Are the head on earth. Most countries economically. Can you hear me? By the way, I get all kind of signals that my network is bad.
Yeah,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Most countries collapsed after communism ended economically. And about half of them never really recovered from that. So people thought, oh, capitalism, we're all going to be rich. And then they really learned what capitalism was and that Marx actually was right all along, and the economy collapsed. Some of them, especially the ones in Europe, did a bit better off because of the European Union pumping money into them. But a lot of these countries are still the poorest countries in Europe, right? And today, a lot of people, of young people, are leaving them. Millions. Countries like Bulgaria, Romania, etc. Most young people try to leave these countries because they're very disillusioned with what happened. They thought it would be great, it wasn't. Also, many of these countries are still not democracies. Some of them are straight up dictatorships. Others are fake democracies, like Russia, where you can vote for one candidate or the other, but that other will mysteriously die the night before the election. So they didn't really recover from this. So the lesson from this is not because communism ended, and it ended for good reasons, and that the other thing was a success, right? Capitalism didn't win. Communism just lost this episode in history. Now that's Soviet Union. I quickly want to talk about some other countries. Unless you have a question for me, I can also listen to that. If not, I want to quickly talk about some other countries that are associated with communism, but that in terms of political thought were not really communist. So things that went horribly wrong, that kind of tried communism but ended up with something else that completely failed for them. One is North Korea, right? North Korea is a bit of a scandal because they really took it very far with the government influence on people. The government there is trying to really micromanage people's lives, trying to totally indoctrinate them about how the world works. And in Soviet Union, people have a quite good idea of what was happening in the world, right? Okay, the government was telling them the good story, but there was limits to this. In North Korea, you know, you have whole fake villages and all that madness happening. And it is not really communist in the sense that you have a monarchy. They themselves also don't claim to be communist. North Korea doesn't consider itself a communist country. It considers itself, I don't know what the name of it is, but it's a type of monarchy. So they're a lot closer to Thomas Hobbes' tyranny than to anything Marx would want, right? Marx would get killed after a week if he lived in North Korea. So it's not communism. They have no respect for basic people. Labor conditions are bad. They kind of pimp out their own workers to capitalist companies, which is not a very communist thing to do. They kind of fail in the welfare department, and they're just unequal. You have a dynasty, right? It's not the same.
Oh, no, no.
So that went bad. Another country that went bad is Cambodia. Cambodia is a case where they had a revolution, and the leader of that revolution was a bit like Stalin, except he was multiple times more crazy than him. Where do I even start? Let me put it simply. And this is a quote from him. He said, this was his plan. He said, in Cambodia, we're going to make a utopian agrarian state with enough opportunities and food for 2.5 million people. There's just one problem. There are 4 million people in Cambodia. So you can guess what's going to happen next, right? He had an actual plan to build a perfect society for less people than were in his country. So he actively tried to kill 1.5 million people. As a policy. With Stalin, it was, it was kind of a mistake he made. Here, this was actually the intent. So everybody who was not a fit worker, that included teachers, for example, all teachers, he would have them killed. He would have them enslaved. They would have to work. They would work to death. And they would enslave more people, etc., etc. So this obviously, again, is not communism, right? It's not about killing people, it's about changing property. Also, you cannot have slaves and be a communist. They're direct opposites. Forced labor, all these things have nothing to do with communism. And it got so bad that actually this ended because of a communist country that attacked them. Vietnam, the neighbor, was like, oh my God, you guys can't be doing this. Oh my God. Okay, you know what? This is too embarrassing. We're just gonna invade these motherfuckers and get rid of this dude. And they did. And they installed a good communist government afterwards, that normal communism without any of this killing. But these are things that you might have heard of that are associated with communism that are quite got off track quite far. Now, I have some positive and negatives, I think, after this, but it's not important. Let me. Do you have any questions or things you want to say about this subject? Miss Paula? Anybody? Okay, what is this? Okay. Nobody has any questions? I thought you would have lots of questions about this.
Can you explain the image?
The image, countries in red and yellow did worse than they did under communism, economically speaking, after communism. Countries in blue did the same, and countries in green did slightly better. So most people, because you have to look in this population, are not better off today than they used to be. Because a lot of these countries like Russia, but also like Bulgaria, etc., they became very unequal after communism. Like they had growth, but all that growth went to some elite, and people stayed in their 1980s or 1990s lifestyle. And a lot of the economy just fell apart. For example, my father has apple plantations in Romania, ex-communist country. In Romania, you used to have large fruit plantations that were collectively owned. And then communism ended, and they just were like, well, then we all go home. And they said, what do we do with the land? Oh, we're gonna divide it via lottery. So everybody got a piece. But that means that people in the capital, right, 400 kilometers away, have some part of a plantation somewhere. So nobody did any work. So this whole region economically collapsed because nobody worked on their land that they got because it used to be collective. And, you know, I know my dad is there trying to start it again, trying to get them, let's say, high-tech variants of growing fruit. So, but that's still like, these places look a lot like rural Mexico looks like, in terms of poverty, in terms of infrastructure. Not the cities. The cities are better off, but rural areas. Susanna has a question. If they broke rules about censorship, what's the point of going to jail only? Or that depends what you're doing. If you lived under Stalin and you would directly attack Stalin, right? You would talk about his mother. You would probably go to prison. Not because that was illegal. They would just find a way to get you in prison. Like, oh, you walk next to the sidewalk. Well, right? Or they would accuse you of stealing something, or, you know, censorship was not open. Like, they always try to hide it. They always try to find a reason to legally get you in jail. Unless you like attack him directly, then he would disappear. But normal censorship, like critiquing communism, you would just, yeah, your boss would get angry at you, or things like that, or they would not hire you again for something else. Kind of how it works here. You would not standard go to prison because you said something critical. No. So this was not that different from Mexico at the same time, and still Mexico up to 2 years ago. Yeah, people desperately leave communist countries. People were, that depends on the country we're talking about, first of all, right? If you talk about Cuba, for example, a lot of people left Cuba, but not more people left Cuba than people left Haiti, Jamaica, or Dominican Republic, or Mexico. A lot more Mexicans left Mexico, percentage-wise, than Cubans left Cuba. A lot more Dominicans left Dominican Republic than Cubans left Cuba, right? So yes, people went towards richer countries because that's what people tend to do, but there's nothing special about that. The same with Europe, right? With the fall of the Berlin Wall, a lot of people wanted to go to Western Europe, partly because their family lived there and, you know, they just want to know how it was and they were tired of not being able to travel. So they were not necessarily trying to leave their countries to like never come back. They were just trying to travel there. So a lot of people were tired of this and a lot of people wanted to leave, yes. But you did not have this massive escape. Afterwards, though, after 10 years, around 2000, a lot of people started leaving these countries because they did poorly. But, you know, there were probably a lot of unhappy people, right? People are constantly trying to leave their country. We might have some time to talk about migration at the end. Any other questions you have on this? Or maybe criticisms or things that you think that I didn't say fairly? That you think, teacher, you're hiding the truth from us?
Teacher,
Yes.
is there like a possibility that the world can become communist? I mean, right now the world is capitalist in the majority, but is there a way that the world can become communist?
I think they would not literally, like what I just told you, right? There are very few people in the world, they exist, but there are very few people in the world who want to repeat that, who want to have a Stalinist system, because it has certain obvious flaws to it in terms of freedoms, right? And that were unnecessary. Communism also worked in the 70s without much of these violence in it. So you would not try the exact same thing again. It's not a very popular guy, even among communists. You have some idiots who like him, but most people don't. So you would never literally try the same, but a Marxist communist system, yeah, you could have that. Capitalism, if it collapses, then we need something else, and this is one option. Someone says it never failed because it never was reached. Full goal, for example, being stateless, moneyless class society workers. Although that is true, yet the failure, like the bad sides of communism, are related to communism, though, right? You can have democratic communism, and you have, for example, in Greece, 10 years ago, communists won the elections, normal elections in a multi-party democracy. The communists won them, right? This happens, but if you have a planned economy that kind of gravitates towards more centralized control, so the things that went wrong, they didn't need to happen, but like I say, the seeds of that were there since the beginning, right? So these problems, they have something to do with communism still, with the core idea of it, although you could avoid them. It's not like this has nothing to do with Marx at all. What's wrong with communism? Let me talk about that. So here are positives and negatives, right? Positives, Sophia asked that. Positives are, it actually worked, contrary to what you believe. They did it. And people lived their normal lives, got married, had children, those children went to university. People lived their lives. It worked. Society did not collapse. They were able to take one of the poorest countries in the world and develop them. China, Russia, some African countries that owe their development to these countries. They did not do so. They achieved a lot of social things for the working class, free education, free healthcare, full employment, etc. For me, one of the most attractive things about communism is their capacity to deal with problems. You can see that even with China today, although they're not really communist. If there's a problem and the government wants to solve it, they will solve it. You saw it with Corona, right? There's an immense difference between the capacity of a communist society to deal with problems and that of a capitalist society. If you compare China to US, right? They just, if they want to solve the problem, then they can move everyone to do that because everybody works for government, so they can just do it. That's, I think, probably the biggest advantage of communism if I would have to argue for it, which I'm not doing, but if I had to. Also, they won 2 world wars. Just to tell you a bit about the cost of this, right? In World War II, 28 million in Russia fighting against the Nazis. Yeah. So they fought the real fight, not the Americans, the communists did. And they also pushed capitalist countries to be more social. Now, the negatives of this, from Marxist perspective, right? They never got to the Marxist point of giving people actually power. Yes, companies had elections inside them and the boss would be elected, but economically it didn't work like that. They were not cooperatives, right? The money would go to the government, not to the workers. Well, not all the money. So they never really did that. They never fully delivered on their social promises. They did it more than anyone else, but not everybody had a nice house, for example, right? They didn't reach the level of consumption that they wanted, although probably higher than Mexico at the same time, probably higher levels of consumption. They didn't reach the goal. It has, as I said, it has a tendency, as a vulnerability towards anti-democratic tendencies, because you concentrate so much power. And then if you elect a leader, but that leader is a madman like Stalin, then that guy has a lot of power, right? So that's kind of a risk that comes with this. Also, I believe they went too hard on reductions of liberty. I think it could have worked without censorship. I think if you're confident in your ideology, I think you can make it work just on arguments alone. I think they could have done it. I think long term it would have been better for them if you had more open debate. If you could more openly talk about the problems while they're happening, you can avoid those problems, right? You could talk about what people are annoyed about, and then you could have solved that. But if you repress that, or no, don't repress it, but if you create a culture where that's not encouraged, then you're not going to solve the problems. So I think that was a failure. Another failure is just the fact that Stalin failed and that this ended at the end really dealt a big blow to the left, right? They hurt socialism, which is not communism, just socialist in general for the next 10 years. Even today, you have Frena talking no al comunismo, right, in Mexico. Although we are not communist, but you know, this stigma, this sticks to the entire left. And that's something I hold against them. They didn't do that well. Miss Astrid says, corruption, the government could fall into corruption and start dictatorship. Yes, that's one of the weaknesses. I hope I answered a bit this question, Miss Sophia. I think one of the big challenges with communism is to be self-aware enough. Like the government can solve a lot of problems. The question is more, do they know about the problems? In order to know about the problems, you need an open society, and not all of these countries had that. And well, you cannot get rich. That's what you want. This is not the system. Any other questions, remarks, criticism? Teacher. Okay. Next time we're gonna jump to the exact opposite side of the spectrum, and we're gonna talk about fascism. A lecture I'm quite passionate about. I also have a reading assignment for you. I'm gonna upload this for next Monday, which is a free day. Or no, let's just say by next class, right? Not next class. Next week, Tuesday, I want you to read a text about the Nazis that I'm going to give you and write a small reading report on it, just like you did with the Communist Manifesto. But I'm going to upload that. One last issue before we go, students. Next Monday is a holiday, right? A national day. That really messes up my course because, you know, they switched the weeks. So what I propose to do is that Thursday, I'm just going to keep talking the second hour, and you can leave if you need to leave, and I'll just record it and you can watch the part that you missed. I don't see another good solution to solve this problem. Okay?
Doctor, I don't know if you knew, but they moved the calendar again. And okay, so I just wanted to let you know.
Thank you for reminding me. I know I'm not always very updated with the bureaucracy. Yes, they moved it, which is basically good news. It gives us more time to see more classes, and it gives you more time to prepare your final project. Okay. If nothing else, then you are free to go.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you. Have a nice day.
Take care. Bye.